Hi everybody, I'm Kiri Ross-Jones, Kew's Senior Archivist, and I have the pleasure today of welcoming you all to our third and final day of our conference, Botany, Trade and Empire. We very much hope you've all enjoyed the discussions and talks so far. I know I personally have found them fascinating and incredibly thought-provoking. Before we start, I have a few quick housekeeping notices. For attendees, your cameras and audio have been automatically switched off, but we very much encourage you to ask questions, and please could you use the Q&A bar at the side of your screen to do so. Questions and answers will be taken at the end of each session, and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible, although we might not be able to answer all, but please feel free to get in touch with us separately if you'd like to continue discussions. There's a simple code of conduct relating to the Q&A in the chat bar at the bottom of your screen. Hello to all of you watching via our YouTube live stream. Unfortunately, we're not able to take questions from our YouTube audience at the moment. I'd like to remind attendees that there's a closed caption option, which will allow you to see live captioning. Please click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen if you want to use this. The conference is being recorded and you'll be sent a link afterwards via email. And there'll also be a link on our conference page, which will be live for 1 month. Please do tweet about the conference, use it as a way to kind of interact with the other attendees and us. Our hashtag is Botany Trade Empire, all one word. So our programme for today, today we're going to start with a series of lightning talks on the theme of decolonising archives, curated by Arike. We then have a panel session called Back to the Future, during which the panellists will reflect on the conference discussions and talks so far, chaired by Professor Felix Driver. For our first session of the day, I'm delighted to welcome Arike, who's just appeared on screen, Managing Director of Black Cultural Archives, who has curated and will be chairing this series of lightning talks on decolonising archives. This is the first time that here at Kew we've worked with BCA, and we're really excited about this and hope it might lead to some future collaborative working. As an archive practitioner, I'm particularly excited about this session that's coming up, which will have a great archive focus. Arike is the Managing Director of Black Cultural Archives and the home of Black British history. She's a registered archivist and author of articles on aspects of archival theory. So over to you, Arike.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Kiri, and thank you also to Kew Archives for hosting these 3 days of discussions. As Kiri mentioned, I'm the Managing Director of Black Cultural Archives. For those of you who don't know, around 40 years ago, a group of activists, artists and educators decided to come together to create the UK's national collection that relates to people of African descent and Caribbean descent in the UK. And that collection grew into the Black Cultural Archives, which is now based at Windrush Square in Brixton. And our mission is absolutely to preserve and document and celebrate the histories of Black people in the UK, which go back thousands of years. So we see ourselves as having the function of a monument for Black history and for British history seen through a Black lens, as well as an educational institution. We work with primary schools all the way up to universities, and we have a gallery, and of course we are also archives. So we have qualified archivists working for us. And so it was really, really lovely for me to have been invited by the team at Kew to curate this session of 4 lightning talks that start to look across the incredible breadth and range of the topic decolonising archives. So we'll look at language, the language of decolonisation. Is it the right term? Is it a term that's become dated? Is it a term that has been co-opted, or is it being used correctly? What does that mean? We'll look at language, we'll look at archival theory, we'll look at hands-on experience of researchers and archivists. We'll look at the micro level of how cataloguing and how collections management works when you're working with collections that sit somewhat outside of mainland white UK history, when we're looking at collections that reflect the global inheritance of Britain and the global shared history of the diasporas, the various diasporas around the world that congregate and accumulate in the archival collections of our country. So we've got some amazing speakers. We'll start with Dr. James Lowry from City University of New York. We'll continue on to, what order have I put here? We'll continue on to Rebecca Adams, who is the archivist at London Metropolitan Archives. Then we'll hear from Dr. Yewande Okuleye at the University of Leicester on researching. And we'll finish with Mel Grant from Wellcome Collection. So I will introduce each lightning talk. They'll have 10 minutes, and then at the end, we will open up to questions and discussion for the plenary. So let's start with Dr. James Lowry. I'll just read his bio, so hang fire for a second, James. James Lowry is the founder and director of the Archival Technologies Lab at Queen's College, City University of New York, where he's an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies. He is an honorary research fellow and former co-director of the Liverpool University Centre for Archive Studies, where he taught following a 10-year career in archives and records management. As a practitioner, James worked in Australia, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean, including projects for international organizations such as the African Union and the International Criminal Court. His research is concerned with information and governance, particularly in colonial, post-colonial, and diasporic contexts. His current projects include Displacements and Diasporas, which explores the technical and theoretical problems connected with disputes and claims over displaced archives. He is also collaborating with colleagues at the University of California, Los Angeles on the Refugee Rights in Records project, which seeks solutions to the informational problems experienced by displaced people. His recent publications include Displaced Archives, which is an edited collection published by Routledge in 2017. He's also the convener of Archival Discourses, the International Intellectual History of Archival Studies Research Network, and he is currently working on a critical history of records management. He is the editor of Routledge Studies in Archives book series. So were we all meeting in person, I imagine that you would be clapping. I hope you're all clapping from your rooms in your houses or offices. And without further ado, James, you can begin the first lightning talk.
Thanks so much, Arike, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right, hope everybody can see that. So my subject today is anti-colonial archival education. At this conference, we've heard some of the ways that record making was crucial to British imperialism, particularly in the acquisition of knowledge of colonial subjects, botanical, geographical, and social. Importantly, record making and keeping also served the empire by transmitting and managing orders in an information network that allowed for control at a distance. Cliches about records and archives as the dusty detritus of the past belie that they are powerful transmissions of data across territories and across time. Similarly, behind such stereotypes as the lowly filing clerk, the officious registrar, and the blue-stocking archivist stand hundreds of years of scholarly and juridical thinking about authenticity, systems design, and the technologies of the information state. In 1947, new courses in London and Liverpool aimed at educating these record keepers for service in the then growing archival apparatus of the state. The Deputy Keeper of the Public Records, Sir Hilary Jenkinson, inaugurated the London course with a speech extolling the mission of the archivist in positivistic precepts that are still observed around the world today. At the so-called end of empire about 20 years later, archival infrastructures in Britain's former colonies varied widely. In the Dominions, white supremacist regimes had established archives to manage the paperwork of the settler colonial state, as well as to mythologize the heritage of exploration and civilization. And I want to point people to a relatively new article by Jamila Gadar that really takes a new look at the Canadian myth of total archives from a decolonial perspective. And in Rhodesia, the Central African Archive was founded with the explicit mission of reifying the glorious history of this young white nation. But in other places, records were left to the hands of fate. Archival education was similarly haphazard, either through funds from their own governments, keen to invest in skills and knowledge for their newly independent countries, or through grants from Britain, keen to gain a benevolent gloss through Commonwealth scholarships. Aspiring archivists came to Britain to study. In fact, a whole generation of African, Caribbean, and to a lesser extent, Southeast Asian archivists were educated at University College London and are today retired or about to retire as directors of National Archives or professors in archival science programs that they built on returning home with master's degrees or PhDs from the Metropole. Given this history, it's not surprising that archival practice and education in the Commonwealth have some shared characteristics and a common professional language. And since networks are made by people, it's not surprising that the meetings of the recently defunct Association of Commonwealth Archivists and Records Managers often had a familial atmosphere, and a lot of enduring friendships have been made through these old networks. But it means that many of these archival education programs belong to a colonial paradigm. The social and technological changes since the 1960s have led to major shifts in archival theory and practice, but there is still limited decolonial activity outside of North America. So now I want to offer a quick review of decolonial archival education in the Commonwealth. In South Africa, informed by the sweep of the movement to decolonize university curricula more generally, archival educators such as Professors Mpho Ngope and Nampombe Sorombe are rethinking what is taught in the archival studies program. At the University of the West Indies, Dr. Stanley Griffin is working on archival questions of reparation and anti-colonial concepts of landscape, foodways, and cultural practices as archival. Work coming out of Canada and Australia attempts to deal with the legacies of the residential school systems and Indigenous genocides by incorporating Indigenous knowledge and empowering community work into archival education. But what about in the UK? Of the handful of programs accredited by the Archives and Records Association to prepare new cohorts of archivists, I really only have information on the two oldest programs, which were London, where I did my PhD, and Liverpool, where I taught for 4 years. At Liverpool, we fostered critical M-level research, held public workshops and meetings about descriptive protocols for racist records and structural problems in the profession, and we taught issues such as the consequences of colonial record keeping. But these are efforts to decolonize. What would an anti-colonial archival education look like in Britain? An education that prepared students to identify and stamp out new or lingering forms of colonialism as they seek to operate in information systems and networks. My guess is that the place that prepared Commonwealth archivists in the colonial mold has also gone the furthest towards anti-colonial education, and I'm talking about UCL here, through a recent formal review. But it's still very much an open question, one that's barely been asked in Britain. What are the pedagogical frameworks and methods for an anti-colonial archival education? I don't know what the answer is, but I do have an idea of what some of the targets are. Our graduates are entering a system where the National Archive is in possession of records expropriated from 37 former dependencies. The Rhodesian Army Archive was stolen by fleeing white nationalists and brought to England via South Africa. No one seems to know where these records are, but they've been catalogued with state funds, and the catalogue is locked up on a university server because its contents are too sensitive, in other words, too incriminating. We see old colonial rivalries play out in forums like the International Council on Archives and UNESCO. We have an international infrastructure for setting technical standards that is difficult to participate in if you're not from a rich country, and which publishes technical standards that are prohibitively expensive. Routes into the profession are exclusionary, and almost everyone at the top of the profession is white, and men are disproportionately represented at the top. Right now, there is scarce funding and a government with a political agenda for cultural heritage. And attempts to discuss issues of structural racism in professional forums result in explosive displays of white fragility and offensive and othering behavior. For a profession concerned with designing information systems for present social use, with documenting and preserving evidence of the activities of the state, and constituting a representative historical record of our communities, there are many serious and deeply consequential issues to be addressed by the profession and its educators. And I want to share this quote with you from Toyin Falola. So the issues that I'm thinking about here raise questions about what it means when we speak about archives. And to quote Falola, "Ritual archives are huge, unbounded in scale and scope, storing tremendous amounts of data on both natural and supernatural agents, ancestors, gods, good and bad witches, life, death, festivals, and the interactions between the spiritual realms and earth-based human beings. To a large extent, ritual archives constitute and shape knowledge about the visible and invisible world, coupled with forces that breathe and are breathless, as well as secular and non-secular, with destinies and within cities, kingships, medicine, environment, sciences, and technology." What would it mean to begin again at first principles in an epistemology that is not born in empire? That's the question that I'd like to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. I was just trying to, apparently you can hear some background sound when I was speaking, so I was just going to try and fix that, but I'll fix it for the next speaker. So that really takes us to the very global macro level, and I hope that's helped to frame for the audience the next set of presentations that we're going to experience. And I hope it started to form a lot of questions in your minds that we can go into deeper detail with in the Q&A section. So next up we have Rebecca Adams. Rebecca Adams is the archivist responsible for the Molly Hunt collection at London Metropolitan Archives. She completed an undergraduate degree in English literature and history from Goldsmiths University in 2016, and then went straight on to complete her master's in archives and records management at University College London. She has been focusing solely on Molly Hunt's records and organising a launch event around the collection, which should happen this year, presumably COVID permitting. So leading on from James's discussion of archival education, Rebecca is certainly a recent product of the archival education at UCL, and so it'd be really interesting to listen to you, Rebecca, in the context of knowing what James has just said about it, and perhaps we'll discuss archival education, your experience of it a little bit more in the Q&A at the end. Okay, Rebecca, I'm handing over to you now.
Hello everyone. Yeah, as said before, my name is Rebecca and I'm an archivist at London Metropolitan Archives. I'll be talking mainly about the Molly Hunt collection and decolonising that collection. But first, I'm going to show a small snippet of a video that was created last year to talk more about Molly, and it was created in collaboration with Culture Mile. I'm Rebecca Adams and I'm an archivist at the London Metropolitan Archives, and today I'll be showing you the Molly Hunt collection, which is a selection of posters and documents. Let's take a look. Molly Hunt was an education psychologist from Ghana, born in 1932. She came to the UK in 1961 and she set up a number of organisations to advocate for young Black children and parents. She set up the Caribbean Parents Group, the Caribbean Parents Group Supplementary School. She set up the Westview Training Academy and the PEV Consultancy, which was a group specifically for therapy and assessments and consultancies for young Black children and adults. So these are a selection of items from the Molly Hunt collection, mainly posters and drafts that Molly Hunt actually created herself and also co-created. This is a poster created by the Caribbean Parents Group. They also created a supplementary school, and a supplementary school was a organisation specifically for young Black children, and it helped teach young Black children about their culture and their heritage and taught them about history that they wouldn't have learned in school. Molly Hunt was very important in making sure that young Black children gained the education they deserved. She made sure that they weren't sent to special needs schools during the 1970s and 80s, when a lot of children were being sent there compared to their white counterparts due to their race. Young Black children were also discriminated against. There was a lot of racism, and she made sure that parents were told about this and actually made sure that they knew that the schools were treating young Black children in this way. I also think this is a really important document from the collection, as it's a speech that Molly wrote and presented at the Descendants Community Education Group. And in this speech, she talks about her profession, how she got into it, the ways in which it's important for the community, just to show about why she actually wanted to come to the UK. So hopefully everyone enjoyed that. Now I'm just going to show my screen. Right, so I'm going to talk a bit more about where I work at the moment, which is the London Metropolitan Archives. The London Metropolitan Archives is the LMA, is a principal archive for the City of London and the Greater London area, and it's actually in Farringdon. The LMA mainly collects histories from London and the London area, but it's also for all Londoners. So there's a large amount of community archives at LMA at the moment. The oldest document at LMA is actually from 1067, which is the William Charter. When it comes to thinking about decolonisation, LMA is very much about active collecting, cataloguing accurately, and making sure records are easy to find. So an example of the ways in which LMA actually thinking about decolonising their archives is through a project called Switching the Lens. It was started back in 2000, and it was a collaboration with British Library, and it was originally called Black and Asian Londoners. But about 20 years later, in the present day, with some staff volunteers, we were thinking about the records, and also how in the records there are 2,600 individuals of African, Caribbean and Asian descent, and thinking about how we could look at this data set and change some of the language. And that's why the title was changed from Black and Asian Londoners to Switching the Lens, Rediscovering Londoners of African, Caribbean, Asian and Indigenous descent. Another project, which is also very important, that the LMA have collected, is the Arike Vanguard collection, which is a BAME LGBTQ plus collection from Arike, and it's from the periods of 1970s to the 1990s. Included in the collection is film footage, ephemera, leaflets, poetry, and it's a very good insight into the social and cultural impacts of the BAME LGBTQ communities during that period. And it's actually housed at Bruce Castle. So on to a bit more about what I'm actually doing and what I'm actually working on. I'm working on the Molly Hunt collection. So I'll tell you more about Molly Hunt, who she actually was. So she was primarily an education psychologist. She was born in Guyana in 1932, and she sadly passed away in 2015. She decided to move to the UK in 1961 to continue her higher education. And when it comes to looking at the collection, we also have to remember that she was born in a British colony. And she also was from a marginalised background from being Black and moving to the UK. When it comes to the collection, there's a huge amount of lots of different records. There's personal records, business records, audio-visual material, and also casework from her time as an educational psychologist in a variety of boroughs. So it also gives a wide view of who Molly Hunt was, her work, her passions, and of course, obstacles. But also, the earlier parts of the collection also start in the 1950s. So there's also somewhat of a colonial view as well. So when we're thinking about decolonising the archive, and we're really thinking about decentering whiteness, I was definitely thinking about this when I was working through the collection and the different processes that I was actually going through. And actually making sure that I brought agency to the collection and kind of how I really would actually decenter whiteness. But what I found quite interesting is that the narrative throughout the collection and throughout the Molly Hunt collection was actually Molly herself decentering whiteness, and actually in some ways you could say decolonize it. The process of decolonizing was already happening within the collection long before I'd even seen it. Examples of this is actually that Molly Hunt was very much advocating for Black people. She centered Blackness all the time throughout all her work. For example, she co-founded an academy called Westview Academy in 1988. And this was mainly an educational and training consultancy. And it set up workshops, educational reforms for Black families and Black children. There was, for example, CV help, and it was really there to help with academic attainment. And this can be seen kind of, she really wanted to make sure that young Black people were really given the tools to be able to really understand what was going on in the education system, their own circumstances, in lots of different ways. So Molly was always making sure that she kind of moved and decentered whiteness in that sense. So another process I think is really important when we think about decolonizing is the appraisal process. When we think about what we want to keep and what we want to throw away within the collection and what actually has value. Obviously, as an archivist, I have to think about it in a different way. I have to think about what I find valuable compared to someone else who might see the collection. And I had to think about that, not just as an archivist, but also as a Black woman myself. I had to think about what researchers might find interesting. I had to think about who these researchers were, as there may be quite a lot of researchers from marginalized backgrounds who want to see this collection and what they might actually find interesting. Not to mention, a lot of community archives have a lot of ephemera or posters, leaflets, for example, that really shows the different organizations and the different things that a lot of the community were actually part of. So I had to think about context, but I also had to remember that I am working in a completely different context to the ones that Molly actually worked in herself. And I had to think about those types of things when I was looking at the collection. So I think when we think about decolonizing archives and when we think about practice, and we have to think about different processes, for example, the appraisal process, we have to think about how collections can actually be decolonized separate from our own experiences, as I had to do that, even though I'm a Black woman and I'm a Black woman and my family are originally from the Caribbean. Much like Molly, I still had different perspectives and I still had different things that I had to think about when looking at the collection. We also have to bring forward our own experiences, and whilst remembering our contexts are very different, but also making sure that we collaborate and we have a better understanding of context of different individuals and community spaces, and thinking about safe community spaces for marginalized groups. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was so interesting. And I really think what we might go into in the Q&A is a little bit more around the idea of where whiteness is centered or decentered, and also on appraisal as well when you're cataloguing a collection. So next we will hear from Dr. Yewande Okuleye. and I'll just read her bio. So she is a ERSC Innovation Fellow in the Department of Genetics at the University of Leicester. She's an interdisciplinary scholar with degrees in biochemistry, fine art, research methodology, and the history of medicine. Prior to returning to academia, Yewande worked as a chemist at the Body Shop International and was part of the pioneering research team, which investigated animal testing alternatives and formulated innovative hair, skin, perfumery, and well-being products. Her interest in ethics and food history informs her research about the role food plays in identity and belonging in the Black diaspora. Yewande is at the forefront of academic research into the emergence of medical cannabis. Her work has informed academia, policy, and the public. She's delivered masterclasses to scientists, industry professionals, and doctors. Yewande's research practice extends to the culture sector. Her research investigates ways to reveal and recover overlooked, misrepresented, and forgotten histories. Inspired by Audre Lorde's call for us to speak truth to power, Yewande invokes art, photography, music, poetry, and performance as channels to engender discussions about power, representation, and change. Yewande is a trustee of Transformed Drug Policy Think Tank. She founded Sister Circle, Black Academics Alliance, and Black Medical Cannabis Alliance. These research community hubs provide a space for the Black diaspora to connect and thrive. So I will now hand over to you, Dr. Okuleye, for your lightning talk, which for the audience's purposes is talking a lot more about research.
Thank you very much, Arike. I'm just going to share my slides. Can we see the slides?
Yes.
Thank you. I decided to name this talk Plants, Power and People. And my talk is really going to talk about subjectivities and feelings, because we talked really and listened throughout the conference about access, decolonization. But underneath all that, we're talking about people. Plants and people have a very intimate relationship, and colonization disrupted that. I'm interested in looking how we can reimagine what that might be. I use poetry as an entry point to talk about the Black lens. I was in two minds whether to call this the Black lens or the Black British Nigerian lens, but we'll settle on the Black lens. And that's just to give a bit about my own positionality in how I've come to think about and bring my lived experience. The Black lens for me is my lived experience as being part of the former colony, because when we're talking about decolonization, there's a binary. You can't talk about decolonization without reflecting on colonization, hence the difficulty of that word. So I bring that with me and the subjectivities of that. I can read between the lines, little broken lines. Yes, broken lines, I know, but I see, I hear, I smell, I feel the unspoken. So what is it that is unspoken? That someone racialized as Black, also a historian that wants to recover these stories. What do I see? What do I sense? And how do I join the dots? And the big thing that I see, or the unspoken thing, is this trust, the broken trust that we inherit from colonization. I'm sure we've all heard about decolonization, whether we pronounce it with the British accent or the American spelling. What actually is it? It's really very layered. But what I'm interested in for us to ponder upon today is the polarity which decolonization brings. You have some people kicking and screaming and really resisting this idea of decolonization. You have on the other side, those really fascinated, like they've got a new Rubik's Cube and they want to have a look and solve a puzzle. Equally important for us to consider these polar opposite points of view. But what I'm really interested in is how can we look at this new problem or opportunity through a shared lens, putting our heads together to look at this shared history. What might we come up with? What are the problems? But I'm looking at what are the opportunities? What can we get excited about? Although there's a lot of consternation and contestation about decolonization, when we look beneath that, it's all this feeling of unease. So there might be the politics of it, the ethics of it. I'm interested in looking at the subjectivity and the feelings. How can we process those feelings? And coming from a discipline point of view, I think the most important thing we should think about is how, as historians and archivists, we have a great opportunity to put a different lens to look at this evidence that's been sitting in this miscellaneous reports or other reports. I'm thinking about the whole queue. I'm really fascinated about delving into what's the possibility of delving into joining the dots from the miscellaneous report. Through my Black British lens, I've always used this term, 6 degrees of segregation. When we think of people and power and the inequity that still remains, like I said earlier, decolonization goes with colonization. What is the remnants? What are the implications of colonization? How has that affected people, the former colonized? 6 degrees of segregation talks about the knowledge, the power, how that knowledge and power has accrued over the years and how it's white dominated. And most of my work is trying to decenter, but also recover, but in the process, reflect back to the dominant culture, the importance of trying to move away from 6 degrees of segregation. And those 6 degrees of segregation could be race, could be gender, could be all those labels that we use to other in the way that we experience our social lived realities. I'm questioning that. I think looking at this archive or what Q could do with the Black Cultural Archives can transform 6 degrees of segregation to something different. I borrow from Maya Angelou, who I really admire and respect, to think about feelings. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So we're back to that feeling of trust. How might we look at something in the archives? How might we look at something in an institution, but relate that to what's on the ground, feelings, both ways? Could this be an opportunity to repair relationships? How might we do that? And I'm thinking through someone that does systems thinking, that if we center people, but what kind of power are we going to give to people if we're going to look at these archives? Most of the time when I work on projects, there's an institution that does community projects and it's very separate. Even when there's this co-production, there is this hierarchy of power that still is maintained. What if we can disrupt that? What if we can reimagine that Q and Black Cultural Archives have some kind of exchange program where people from both institutions at different levels go into the archives and reconfigure how a project might be? What process would that take? And what would the outcomes look like? And how might we even do a longitudinal research to look at the trust? That's what interests me. So I've just taken a as my starting point, I listened to Rachel's talk, and Rachel talked about Mr. Daudu, who came from Nigeria to study in Kew. And about half an hour before that, I spoke to my auntie, who is Mrs. Daudu. And I thought, what are the chances of that? So I would like to see my history. Let's take Mr. Daudu. And I thought of some food. I thought some plants, beans, yam, and plantain. Although it was random, it's a really nice, delicious meal, you know, beans and yam and plantain, so many combinations. Let's look at that as a starting point. So we look at that from the scientific point of view, but from the scientific at the Q, we could actually find the cultural, the social, but I'm looking at not only Q, but also could we link that to Nigeria? And the power dynamics will be different here because it will be Nigerian academics, Nigerian herbalists, have these two conversations going on. Look at it in a more broader sense. The British Nigerian are the largest ethnic group in England. I'm so glad we're having the census too, and that we'll get the result from the census. There's a whole diaspora of British Nigerian people in the UK. What if we had something like Nigeria is much more than jollof rice? That would be very interesting. So this is just a reimagined panel of an exhibition, an online exhibition, or you know, after COVID, maybe in the particular space. But this could also expand to transnational conversations. I went to Singapore 2 years ago, and I went to Lowry, and this is a one-star Michelin restaurant where the whole ethos was crossroad food. And I had this bean food, and the history around the bean. There was a taste of Brazil, taste of Nigeria. It was just this fusion. And I thought, yes, that is something that from just looking at beans, we could even just look at yam. There's a whole culture around yam that even till today, even in places like Dublin, I just did a Google search, they do the Yam Festival. The Yam Festival goes back centuries, but it's still celebrated here. And I would love to curate this. So this is just something that I imagined. What if we also had the Oni of Ife, who is the spiritual leader of all the Black diaspora, come and be part of this? So it's how can we reimagine this? So this is just a project of reimagination. And thinking about imagination, I went to Andre Breton, who's a surrealist, just for the fun of it. The man who could not visualize a horse galloping on a tomato is an idiot. That is one extreme, because I tried very hard and I could not imagine a horse galloping on a tomato. So I don't know, I don't know what Andre Breton was on, but also let's look at what Muhammad Ali says. A man who has no imagination has no wings. And I think this project has wings to fly from Kew, which is in the leafy suburbia of London, to a different part of London where the spiritual home of the Windrush generation put their flag to stay in the UK. So I hope this has made us think, or we'll have something to say about feelings and subjectivity, something that we won't normally have thought about regarding dry archives. The archives can come alive through plants. So thank you so much. And do follow me on Twitter. I'm at Yewande's London, so we can continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okuleye. I actually really love the phrase crossroad food. I think that is something that actually is so evocative, but also speaks to that intangible heritage, intangible edible heritage, that it can be a platform for telling and sharing stories. I think there's something really, really interesting there. Okay, so we have one more of the lightning talks, and then we will go into discussion. And there's so much, we've really had such a richness and layering of content for you, for the audience, the attendees, I should say, today. But now we've gone global, we've gone macro, micro, macro again, and we're going to come back to hands-on archival practice when we hear from Mel Grant. Mel Grant is the Collections Development Manager at Wellcome Collection. Mel leads a team that works holistically across the collections as it develops and across library, archive and museum practice. And Mel is going to tell us much more about what that actually means when you're in the thick of it. So we've heard a lot about theory, we've heard a lot about aspirations and ambitions, and now we're going to go back to hands-on practice. So thanks very much, Mel, and I'll leave you to it.
Thank you. It's great to be here today. So as Arike mentioned, I'm currently the Collections Development Manager for Wellcome Collection. We're a museum and library that explores health and the human experience, and our vision is to challenge the way we all think and feel about health. So I was invited to talk about developing collections as part of decolonial practice. I'm going to talk through in a very practical way about how the collections development team at Wellcome works, thinks, and how we challenge ourselves. And I'm not going to make distinctions between what parts of our practice may or may not be decolonial, but I want to make the point that decolonizing isn't just something we need to think about in relation to our legacy collections, that we're creating new legacies and that we need to be critical of our contemporary collecting practices, because we're part of a long lineage of collectors. We need to learn from that past and be conscious of it whilst looking to the future and determining where we want to go. So at Wellcome Collection, collecting has been happening for over 100 years, and that collecting began during the lifetime of our founder, Henry Wellcome. And often at this point in a presentation, when we talk about who we are, you'd be shown an image of Henry taken in the late 19th century, a white man, an enormous mustache, and really the epitome of wealth and privilege. But I'm not going to show you an image of our founder, because we've been guilty of centering him and oversimplifying how our collections came to be and perpetuating a white male centric order. We acknowledge we exist because of the privilege of a wealthy white man, and collecting was driven by colonial activities. But who did the work, how they did it, the systems of knowledge and power that they were operating within is a much more complex picture than the mythology of Henry Wellcome. And in our contemporary collecting practices, we have to consciously push against those structures and do that wherever we can. So I wanted to talk briefly about the configuration of the collections development team. So we're currently a team of 5 with 2 librarians, 2 archivists, and then the manager. And we work holistically across the collections, across museum, library, and archive practice. And we work collaboratively to make decisions as a team. And this helps us to challenge what we do and the received practices that we've become accustomed to. And it allows us to push at the boundaries of what it means to be a librarian or an archivist, because we're products of our training. And despite this sector becoming feminized, our professions are founded on patriarchy. Senior positions are still often predominantly held by white men. So we need to be critical and approach that creatively to instigate positive change. And it's also been important to create a team environment where we can reflect on our identities as well as who we are as employees of Wellcome Collection. And this has helped us develop an ethical approach to collecting that has a duty of care to individuals and communities. So we think very deeply about the work that we do and our role in that, and have conversations that might be uncomfortable around our collecting practices. But it's part of enabling us to develop an active anti-discriminatory practice. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in the context of our acquisitions process. So like all collections, we regularly get offered material. Generally a self-selecting group. The who and what can tell us quite a lot about the public perception of Wellcome Collection and quite frankly, who we're failing to engage with, which is why it's also important to do more strategic collecting, to take the time to analyze the collections, to look for what is missing and what can be amplified. So for example, there's a period in our history where we primarily collected from a medical perspective. We sought to acquire all seminal texts in medicine. The parts of those collections that addressed race, disability, gender, sexuality were mostly offensive and discriminatory. So in our most recent collections development policy, we've made it a priority to collect from the perspective of lived experience and to amplify the voices of those discriminated against and marginalized. But why should we even be trusted with people's stories if people haven't been part of or even seen themselves as welcome in some of the spaces we inhabit? There's a power dynamic there, and we have to acknowledge that, and we work towards building equitable and sustainable long-term relationships, to be sensitive, to listen, to learn, and consider what we're asking of people. So, for example, if we ask someone for their time, how does that impact on their lives? Will they be financially disadvantaged? And what is the emotional labor of what we're asking for? We produce reports for potential acquisitions, and our thinking really comes through there, and it enables us to have quite open conversations with colleagues about potential acquisitions. We also seek external opinion for the reports, and then we present them in a meeting where anyone at Wellcome can come along and offer their opinions. So they don't need to be an expert or a curator, and everyone is welcome and their contributions are valued, and we expect to be challenged in that forum. We've also been encouraging colleagues from outside of collections development to propose acquisitions, because it shouldn't just be about what the collections development team wants. We need to bring more voices into the collections, but that's also about who's creating those collections and making those decisions. But I think there's so much more we can actually do here, and I hope to expand on the work we've been doing with communities outside of Wellcome to experiment actually with taking some of that decision making out of our hands. And as well as what we can do in the team, there also needs to be support and leadership within the organisation, and it needs to be outward facing. So in June 2020, Wellcome Collection put out an access, diversity and inclusion strategy and created an inclusion team. So they aim to put AD&I in every part of our work, and the strategy tells the public what our intentions are, so then we can be held accountable, but it also gives staff across Wellcome a shared aim. So in relation to our collections and content, that policy states a deeper understanding of our institutional heritage and the cultural meaning and context of our collections is reflected in how we develop, manage and present them. So there are many pieces of work happening across Wellcome Collection to help us do this, but one I think is quite significant that I wanted to mention today is Transcribe Wellcome. So the aim is to transcribe all of the accession and collections registration records between 1897 and 2000. Most of this archive is digitized and publicly available, but it's a really big, complex and difficult to navigate set of material. So actually by transcribing it, we aim to help researchers explore the provenance and the collecting histories of items acquired for the Wellcome Museum and Library. And already that work is starting to help us dispel some of those myths around our collections. It's decentering Henry Wellcome, and it will increase transparency around colonial histories of collecting. And later this year, when the information starts to become publicly available, we're hoping to see more research that we can learn from, because the truth of our collections, who was making the knowledge and who they made it for, is really important in terms of our future direction as well. And the other thing I wanted to discuss in relation to leadership being outward facing is in June 2020, Wellcome Collection put out a statement on anti-Blackness and racism, and it acknowledges that museums, including Wellcome Collection, are built on white supremacy. And in relation to our collections, it states that they provide us with a powerful means to center the narratives and lived experiences of those who've been silenced, erased and ignored. So there's an affirmation there of how we've been working and putting people at the center of that process. And this statement impresses that we must be anti-racist, we must help carry the burden of getting the work done, because it is work and it is exhausting. And as a continuation of this, Wellcome is also working on a social justice curriculum, an inclusive communications approach, and a first aid manual for engaging with collections. So it should all help move us towards becoming an anti-racist and anti-ableist organisation. Because in 2020, we really saw those inequalities in healthcare and society laid bare, and the reality that racism and ableism are pervasive. So we've had to turn that into action when developing our collections. So one example of how we're doing that is experimenting with commissioning new work for our collections. So in this round of commissioning, that's artwork and accompanying archival material. And the aim is to really establish commissioning as a distinct collecting strand, because some voices have been so marginalized, there either isn't existing material to bring into the collections, or there isn't enough of it. So we can really support people to create new material, to take an active stance on increasing representation and addressing subjects like colonialism and health inequalities within that. So one example is one of the commissioned artists is Kairani Baraka, an Indonesian writer and interdisciplinary artist who works with the legacies and futures of colonialism and how we might wrestle with them in the present. And they state about the work they're developing that it's an investigation into colonialism's duress, persisting in molecular form during, before, and after the pandemic and NHS stay-at-home policies. And another approach has been giving our time and expertise generously to those who are considering the future of their materials, particularly community groups, regardless of whether we might acquire those materials for our collections. So helping people to look after what they have and think about where an appropriate home for that material might be, because we recognize we're part of a huge landscape of collections and we're not always the most appropriate home for material offered to us, but we can help it find its way to where it needs to be. We've also recently recruited an inclusive collections officer to the team, a permanent role that will help us improve our ability to develop, manage, describe and interpret our collections, to do that respectfully and in collaboration with source communities. And that role will have a focus on restitution and repatriation. And it will also connect us to work happening in our galleries that is going to seek to look at the power structures that are reflected in our galleries that we might not adhere to today. So hopefully I've shown that colonial practices aren't actually dead. We're still grappling with the past in our contemporary collecting practices, and it is actually disturbingly easy to fall into the trap of reinforcing the systems we're fighting against. And it's really a continuous process of reflection and change and sometimes failure. But we feel we need to use our collections and our privilege for good and to interrogate our practices and amplify marginalized voices. I think over the past few days, we've all seen the huge value of the work we all do in such a variety of ways, and it's been a huge inspiration. But I think also it's a real worry that nationally we're seeing political interference, redundancies, the cutting of library and archive provisions in particular, being seen as an easy way to save money. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, but we need each other and the support to be able to do it. And that's everything from me today.
Thank you so much, Mel. I wonder if the other panelists could video on as well, if you're comfortable with having your video on, as we'll now go into the Q&A section. I wanted to recognise and acknowledge, Mel, that note that you ended on, and I really appreciate that you ended on that note about collaborative cooperation and mutual support for one another as professionals, but also as organisations and research institutions in this time that we're all going through. And changes in New York at the moment, and New York has its own interpretation of how to respond to the pandemic. Some of us are in London, which again has a very specific way of responding to the pandemic. But I think what we can all see in our various locations around the world is that while this technology of being able to collaborate on one event whilst in many different locations is causing us to have instant connection, the reality behind the scenes of our hands-on work is that it's really, really suffered as a result of the pandemic. And that has an economic effect on jobs in the cultural sector, as well as a physical effect on those collections, which no longer have people looking at handling or preserving them. Okay, so we have quite a few questions in the Q&A, which I think are quite big questions that might take a little while to answer. However, we only have 20 minutes for discussion, and I would like to ask a couple of questions as well. So I have all these questions. I will try and, instead of asking these, ask some more open questions for all of you, and then we'll dive into the Q&A, which I can see is filling up. So one thing that I thought really resonated with me across all of your talks, your provocations and explorations, was about the use of language. So I wonder, because this panel, this session was conceived around the very specific word decolonizing, and I'm aware that that is becoming more and more of a loaded term, that contested histories is being proposed as another term, but that also has started to gather its own political weight to it. And I just wondered whether each of you, whoever wants to go first, would briefly speak to the idea of how language is used and what you think the current terms are that you are using in your practice that could be considered a decolonial practice. Are you comfortable with that term? Do you use other terms? And maybe just explore language a little bit more. And Rebecca, especially because you had used terms like decentering whiteness. So thank you.
I might just jump in here. I think when you talk about language, you can't remove language and power. So it's like it depends on who is talking about decolonization and where it's coming from. So I never used the term decolonization, but the work I've been doing for the last 20 years is a decolonization process. Because I looked at the archives, I didn't see myself in the archives, and I'm looking for remnants of my people in the archives. Decolonization also, the whole project of being racialized as Black, you're in the process of decolonizing to find yourself. So it depends on how it's been used, but also what are the agendas of the people that are using decolonization. So like any other term, it's loaded, and for us to be very critical about what we understand. But what my focus is I don't use that term anymore because it has so many layered meanings. It's like, what's the intention behind what you're doing? And as practitioners, I think we need to educate the public, or even really center this term to what are we doing here? Are we talking about the big decolonization? Or are we talking about process? Or are we talking about it on the ground? Or I always use Rastafari as an example. Rastafari is a perfect project of people that decolonize themselves. So yeah, language, but also you can't divorce it from power. You know, the way the Daily Mail might talk about decolonization will be very different from how the decolonization is being talked about in a lecture hall.
I think when it comes to language, especially when I was talking about decentering whiteness, it's kind of thinking about where specific ideas come from. So, for example, in the Molly Hunt collection, it starts as Molly was from a colonial, was from Ghana, which was a colony of the UK. So it's very much thinking about how she could use language in different spaces. And thinking about the context of her using that particular language, and therefore thinking about that could be on the side of the colonial side, and also thinking about what Molly might actually wanted to say at the time. So kind of thinking about the ways in which we view a collection, and thinking about it's not just about specific narratives. It's about narratives of everyone, and specifically Black people, and narratives of Black people who are important, and actually that should be uplifted. I think that's kind of what I mean in terms of decentering whiteness, uplifting individuals who weren't necessarily heard before, or their voices were unheard, and I feel like I'm doing that in terms of when working with the Molly Hunt collection and different things I'm doing, because I'm uplifting Molly and I'm uplifting her stories, but also the stories of different people that she knew in the community, etc. So that's what I mean when I say.
I might just hop in here. So I was actually a little bit reluctant to use decolonization as a term when I was talking today, because we haven't really been articulating the way that we work specifically in relation to that theory. And I think because when we're collecting, we're thinking about so many different things. To put it, it feels like putting it in a decolonization kind of bracket. Although that plays into what we're doing, there are so many things that we're thinking about that it seems almost limiting to just have that label there, even though it plays into a lot of the ways that we think and the ways that we do things, but it's not the only thing. There's lots of different things that come into that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what everyone on the panel has said. And I think decolonial can be a kind of, not a smokescreen necessarily, but a kind of an easy way out in a way. We can talk about decolonizing the curriculum by kind of changing the reading list, like including more Black authors on the reading list. But what does that really achieve? Like it's a positive step, but there's still kind of structural issues underneath that I think the concept of decolonization kind of gloss over. But having said that, I still think there is value in thinking about what decolonizing the archive means, because as I mentioned, in the UK, there are collections of records that belong to other countries and to other cultures. And we can literally decolonize those archival spaces by sending those records back. So there is still work to be done, but I think at the more structural level, maybe we need to be thinking about anti-colonialism and taking more intentional steps, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. That's all really helpful to me as I work through for Black Cultural Archives what we mean when we talk about and use these terms. And hopefully it was also useful for the researchers and archivists who are attending this to understand more about the different applications of those kind of terms. Okay, so I'm going to go into the Q&A because there's about 15 questions in here and we only have 10-15 minutes left. I am going to go straight to, let's see. Let's go for a question to Rebecca, because this question links the rest of the conference around Kew's miscellaneous reports and the collections at LMA, which might relate to the City of London's trading in tea, opium, rubber. So the question for Rebecca, just thinking about connections between Kew's miscellaneous reports and City of London archives. Many of the plant products discussed in the MISC reports were traded in the City of London, for example, tea and opium and rubber. Do you think there might be possibilities here?
Well, I definitely think in terms of the question, thinking about what's actually at the LMA, I definitely, there's a lot of collections at LMA, many collections. And I think there would definitely be a connection between the transactions that happened within the City of London. I definitely think it would be actually very interesting to have a look. And I'm sure there are probably many people who are probably looking at that anyway. But I definitely think there would be a connection. It would be something to actually look into. And I might not be the authority person to speak on this, but I definitely think emailing LMA or emailing, or I can find some information about it, and or definitely get in contact with Fundamental Archives if you want to learn more.
Thank you. Okay, so there's quite a lot of interest in the Q&A box around disrupted plants and people and stolen collections. So I'm trying to figure out a way of kind of combining those. One of the comments is, Dr. Yewande, it says, myself being an ethnobotanist, I totally agree with an important point said by you, i.e. colonization disrupted plants and people's relationships. And then there's also a note from one of the attendees saying, I was particularly interested in the question of stolen archives. I was in Mozambique looking for, climate collection maybe, to find Maputo had none, and they had been airlifted to Lisbon. How can we redress this? So I think this is probably for Dr. Okuleye and Dr. Lowry to comment on. I guess they're not really questions, but if you could maybe comment on the ideas that those comments contain.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, there is work going on at the international level about this problem of displacement. So the International Council on Archives has an expert group on shared archival heritage. But there again, this is where, you know, that question of language comes in, because in post-colonial context, are we really talking about a shared heritage? Because, yeah, as you say, researchers who are in Maputo or in other parts of the world are, you know, not able to access collections that actually have a kind of territorial provenance. And I kind of wanted to pick up on, there were some questions about what does anti-colonial or decolonial practice look like. And I think it is, part of that is describing our collections in such a way that we are flagging up the kind of cultures, but also the locations that these records come from. So yeah, I think there's kind of strategic things we can do at the international level, but also just in our day-to-day practice, thinking about place is important. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted you to talk about the institutional aspect. And I think this is something, apart from the institutional, the communities affected by this need to be involved in shaping this, because I think to kind of move forward, and if you look at it as plants, as healing, as healers, we need to have that dialogue and understand the language and the intention. But it has to come. I always give this an example of people that used to work in a lab. So I used to work in a lab. I did my training as a chemist, and I just didn't. I hated the testing on animals. So I went away from biochemistry, and I started working with plants. And I know people, for ethical reasons, have given up their profession, not working with animals, because they can't stand the animal testing. I think at some point people within the industry have to now think about the legacy of these archives, of these artifacts on an ethical and a personal level, and look at it that way. I think it has to come from within now, and also the community, that this is a question of ethics. How do we really, and restitution, how do we move forward? And until we get to that state where people involved, the professional involved, really look at it from very close lens and not just institutional, I think all those things have to happen. All those clog wheels have to work together before this could be resolved, or else we'll keep on, in 100 years' time, people will be sitting and having the same conversation. It needs to get done. We need to really look at it and move forward. I'm bored already.
Okay, so on that note, I'm going to skip to one of the questions for Mel. It's a question, about decentering Wellcome. So Henry Wellcome. So it says here, academics have been busy decentering the history of the Wellcome collection for 20 years. Do you think there's a disconnect between academic writing and collections management? So I think that's quite interesting to lead on from what Yewande was saying, because she's bored of having this conversation over and over again. Yeah. And is welcome, and perhaps how different are the practices that you're doing now to the practices that were done 20, 30 years ago? Will the next generation of Wellcome collection development have a different practice?
Okay, so first of all, decentering Henry Wellcome. So that has been ongoing for a long time, and there has been previous research into how Wellcome has been collecting over many years. But the reason I brought up Transcribe Wellcome was because there's a piece of that that's been missing. And what that is helping us to reveal is a wider picture of how many people were collecting, more information on who those people were, more information on where they were, how they were doing it. So it's a continuation of something that's been happening for a long time, but something that really needed to happen to keep pushing us forwards. So I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's important that we do that. So I think there are about 3 parts to your question. So one was about how collections development was working in the past. So I've been at Wellcome Collection for 8 years. So certainly in the time I've been there, what I've seen is a change from a curatorial model that worked with very specific parts of the collections, and worked with that part of the collection from beginning to end. But what we found was happening was that put boundaries around materials in a very format-based way. And so we didn't think ultimately that that was the most helpful way to look at our collections. So we made a really big change about 5 years ago, which was really about looking holistically across the whole collections and not thinking in a very format-based way. So when we're thinking about developing our collections, we're looking for what we want to represent and seeing where that representation is coming through in the world. And so it might be that one year we might end up collecting mainly archives and less books or less artworks. But then the next year, maybe we'll be shifting our focus and we'll move towards artworks because that's where their voices are coming through. We put boundaries around the way we were collecting in what we felt were unhelpful ways, and we've been doing that for quite a long time. So this is a way to think holistically and hopefully bring more representation to the collections where we need it. Was that all of the questions answered?
I don't know. Near enough. Okay, so I actually, there's a question that's addressed to Melanie and Rebecca. However, I think that all of you would be able to answer it. So the question is, are you able to suggest tools, models, or guidance that enable archivists to move towards the type of decentered, agency-driven practice you have spoken about today, particularly for processing, describing, and exhibiting collections? But I think that that can actually be broadened out to suggest tools, models, guidance in terms of archival education and also for researchers as well. So I think this, because it's quite a big question, it might be our last one, we'll see. But again, decentering patriarchal practices, I'm just going to leave it open to whoever feels like answering first. But I think that each of you will probably be able to speak to this question.
And I'm just trying to think, there's so many sources that we've used over the years that thinking of them all right now is a tricky one. But I'd be happy to pull something together to share with people.
Well, I think there were a lot of sources listed in James's presentation. So I think the intention for the question is, I think, you know, sometimes when practitioners attend these kind of sessions, they're just really, some of the motivation is just really get some practical tips. So I don't know whether they're really looking for bibliography, but certainly in James's presentation, there were lots and lots of academic sources and things like that. But I think that it could be something within that you might be able to share some sort of quick either examples or point or signpost people towards where they can start building their own resource list.
Well, for me, it wasn't necessarily written tools. I think a lot of what I practiced as an archivist came from my own personal experience. I know that there are a lot of Black archivists in the UK. They're obviously they are around, yes, but there's not many of us. So it was kind of thinking about how I wanted to actually personally look at collections and look at actually archiving things, because it's not even necessarily about Molly Hunt as a Black woman. It's also about how I look at different collections and how I actually look at different collections in the future, because obviously every collection that we look at and every different way in which we approach archives is going to be different. And thinking about the language that we use, for example, and thinking about how we approach different processes can be different for everyone, but it was all kind of based on my own personal experience. And I think that's probably slightly different because I am a woman of color and I'm a Black woman, and kind of thinking about how I actually wanted to use my archival education, but maybe in a different way, and maybe thinking about it outside of the box and outside of that specific archival education, if that makes sense.
I think that makes complete sense to me as well. So, I mean, I'm trying to think of specific sources, but you know what I've learned from the time I've been at Wellcome in particular is we've changed our practice by giving stuff a go and trying it out. And sometimes it means we don't get it right straight away, but we've definitely got it wrong if we've not had a go. And that's been the really important thing, is like, you know, Arike and I worked on a project a while ago, which was looking at art and health and working with artists. And we tried to write some principles on how we would work with artists before doing the work. And I'll be honest, it was a failure. And then we did the work, and then we were able to do something, and it made so much more sense because we needed to talk to people and we needed to figure it out kind of in action rather than trying to write something without having done it.
I think.
Sorry, please go on.
Thanks. I think I'll concur with that. I always say you have to look at bespoke. Everything needs to be bespoke, because sometimes you can get inspiration from things that, models that already exist. But if people are replicating the same model, then it becomes quite bland. So you're looking for bespoke solutions. And also, I love what Melanie said about taking risk and experimenting and actually learning from the field, or this 6 degrees. And I was thinking about 6 degrees of separation to make sure that your practice is definitely inclusive. And I'll give a quick example. There are not many Black people in high positions in this industry at all, although we do have some Black archivists, but I've been practicing for like 20 years, and I think you're one of the very few that I know, Rebecca. So I remember being the only person with a Black lens in a museum, and there was a particular picture I saw, which I thought, this is really interesting. It had some Nigerians in it, and I took it, and as soon as I saw it, I knew something was off. And that was what my poem was about, that I see between the lines. I just something was off, and I looked at it and I thought, aha, that's this. There's some Black people in here, but there's some white people with painted faces. And I took it around the office for like a week just to show people in the office. And none of my white colleagues saw this. They just didn't see it. And then when I showed it to them, they saw it. And I thought, that is why I need to be here, because I picked that up. That was a layer that was staring everyone in the face, but they didn't see it. I could see, because I'm pigmented, that there was something wrong. So it's important to, if you're going to do it, it's inclusive, or you want to have a model. The model, all we need to start with is, we're not just doing it for political reason or ethical reason. We're doing it because the Black lens allows us to see something that someone else will not see. So that's just what I want to.
So we're slightly over time. So James, I'm just going to come to you for any top tips from your huge,
Thank you. I was champing at the bit to answer this question because I really loved Rebecca's presentation, because it shows this move. Like when I was trained as an archivist, we were told that we had to kind of push our positionality aside and try to achieve neutrality. But Rebecca's example of like acknowledging her own lived experience and expertise and using that in her appraisal, that does mark a major shift in archival thinking. And so I wanted to point to Michelle Caswell's article called Dusting for Fingerprints, which talks about this embrace of positionality, and then generally to point people to a resource called archivistsaagainst.org, which has kind of teaching materials and guides to practice that try and address many kind of issues to do with race, class, gender, and so on. So that's archivistsaagainst.org. Yeah, thank you.
You take direction so well, James. That was so concise. A dream. Okay, everyone, because we are over time, I am just going to invite you all to clap in the comfort of your own screens or devices. And on behalf of that silent applause that's resonating around the world with our over 260 attendees, I just want to pass on their thanks and my thanks and Q's thanks to our panelists. It has been a really enriching experience for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. And I hope to continue all of these conversations and to keep developing this area of archival practice, which I think is finally gathering momentum. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the last session of the conference, which began 3 days ago with a stirring introduction from the Director of Science at Kew, Alex Antonelli. There's been a lot of very interesting sessions since, and we've got a panel who's going to reflect for us on those sessions. And these aren't called lightning talks, but they are in fact lightning talks. Lightning strikes twice in this case. So each of the speakers will talk for up to 5 minutes on their reflections. Our first speaker is Arike, who, as you know, is from Black Cultural Archives.
Hello everyone. So yes, I'm the Managing Director of the Black Cultural Archives, which is the home of Black British history. Our building is based at 1 Windrush Square in Brixton in London, and we are a national heritage centre which collects, preserves and celebrates the histories of Black people in the UK, which is of course a global narrative. And so we were very delighted to be able to work with our colleagues at Kew to curate the panel, which has just ended, which was about decolonising archives and decolonial archive practice. So coming straight hot from that panel, I'm afraid you will have to experience a deconstructed, shall we say, set of reflections rather than a perfectly written 5-minute talk. I am just going to have a quick look at the time so I can time myself and not run over, but Felix, by all means, interrupt me if I overrun my time slot. So in our panel, which invited practitioners from actually a range of archival specialisms and from outside of the UK as well, but what's interesting is that we were all from outside of Kew, and so we were contextualizing the rest of the conference within the macro of archival practice as well as the micro of the hands-on experience of those practitioners. So we began with James Lowry, Dr. James Lowry, who is an archival educator. And what was very exciting really to hear from him was very much around the international context that's so appropriate for Kew and its collections, because it is an international collection that relies on these methods of knowledge exchange, but also historically, we might say, knowledge extraction as well. And so to think about archival education, archival practices, and where these collections from around the world originate or end up, or how they're interpreted, was a very, I think it certainly sparked a lot of reflection for me. James began to talk about the fact that so much of the international archival practice is influenced by Western archival education, and in fact, what effect does that have on international conversations that are possible around archival collections? So we also heard from Rebecca Adams, who is an early career archivist working at London Metropolitan Archive on a collection that's very much a collection that could be said to reflect London. So we went from the international to the hyperlocal, and despite it being a hyperlocal collection, it also spoke to those journeys, those heritage journeys, those intangible journeys that history makes crisscrossing the oceans, because Molly Hunt, which is a collection that Rebecca looks after, Molly Hunt, of course, was what we might include within our understanding of the Windrush generation now. We also heard from Dr. Yewande Okuleye, who spoke a lot more about language and degrees of separation. She talks about food, ingredients, crossroads of food as a crossroads of intangible but edible heritage. And I'm very, very interested in plants as ingredients and plants as sites of connection, sites in which we can have individual experiences and begin to have discussions. And so especially thinking about edible plants in terms of Kew, and thinking about food as a form of ritual that we use, for example, for birthdays, celebrations, Christmas, wakes, and how that food arrives at into our spaces, into our personal and private and professional spaces. Okay, so super interesting reflections from Yewande there. And then we went again to professional practice with Mel Grant from Wellcome Collection and started to reflect on how the evolution and discussions of collections practice unfold and evolve over time. And ultimately, I think from our session, and I wonder how that reflects the rest of the conference, a lot of what we were talking about was in fact the use of language and the need to be brave and take risks and experiment in order to iteratively develop a practice together. And that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arike. Our next speaker is Kiri Ross-Jones, who is the Senior Archivist at Kew.
Thanks, Felix. Hi, I'm going to reflect a little bit on the conference, but more on the Wellcome funded project, which is just coming to an end after 2 years. Project that Rachel and Amy have been working on, conserving and cataloguing the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. I mean, my first point is kind of what a difference having a resource and kind of staff who have time to work on a collection makes. You know, without Rachel and Amy, this collection would have remained as it was, kind of on the shelves in our store, but largely inaccessible and unknown about, really. So, you know, it really has made a massive difference. For any archivists listening, the Wellcome Research Resources Programme is a great one. Please do check it out. I think it's changing this year, but it's all on their website, so have a look at that. And that's what funded this particular project. The project has given our staff, our project staff, time to engage with the collection, although obviously within the confines of the original project goals to catalogue and conserve it and make it accessible. I know Rachel's done a lot of things. We've had lots of kind of conversations about how we can really liberate this information through kind of indexing and terms. But as Johanna, who spoke yesterday, mentioned, we're doing this within the confines of historics, which we work the kind of sector standards, which, you know, kind of insist on a certain kind of categorisation. And Rachel's done much work trying to kind of use these to kind of signpost things like Indigenous knowledge, where it might appear in the work, that kind of thing, and highlight this. Thinking about what I would do differently if I was applying to Wellcome again for this project, I think I'd like to give more time to this side of the project and build in more decolonising, or I really like how Rebecca spoke about a decentered approach to the cataloguing, a more kind of innovative way maybe of working with the collections and the communities from where these collections originated, where the knowledge came from. I think that could be really interesting, and I know Mark has done some work like this in the past that I think he might mention later. I was quite excited to find out that ARA, the Archives and Records Association Diversity Allies, has a working group whose theme is decolonising archive catalogues. Apparently they're currently assessing guidance around cataloguing with the ultimate goal of producing some documentation for cataloguers. So I'll be watching that keenly to see if it's something we can use in our processes. Something that we feel has been missing from our project is public engagement, kind of engaging with the communities from where this material came from, either you know, in the UK, the kind of diaspora community, or in their original source communities. We did apply for funding to do some kind of co-produced type work using the collection, kind of interpreting the plants in the palm house, but unfortunately the funding grant wasn't successful, but it's something we're constantly thinking about and we would still very much like to do. I loved Yewande's ideas around this. You know, it's something we'd be really keen, really love to do something like that. So hopefully this is something we can take forward. And I feel it really is missing from the work we've done so far. I also wanted to briefly talk about a Techne-funded collaborative PhD we have at the minute, jointly supervised by Kew and the University of Roehampton and Dr. Kate Telsher there. This student, who's just starting now, is going to look at the miscellaneous reports, and her PhD is entitled Kew's Imperial Archive Cataloguing Economic Botany in the Miscellaneous Reports. She'll have some time to look at the origins of the collection and kind of get to grips with its history, why it's called what it is, how it's formed, either through kind of a material culture approach or close reading. And we're hoping she might also have some time to do some of the reading against the grain that Professor Richard Drayton spoke about on the first day, and find those kind of names and stories that are not explicit within the collection or even maybe missing. This is something, as archivists, we're kind of acutely aware needs to be done, but frequently don't have the time, or it's outside of our remit, or necessarily the skills to do this kind of work. So we are really excited by this PhD. Finally, when Miranda spoke yesterday, she talked about how it's a continual process of decolonising and opening up collections. Although the miscellaneous reports now are officially catalogued, you know, and access has been massively increased. Their catalogue is now available online in our archive catalogue. This is very much the start of our work. It's absolutely not the end. And it's something, you know, we very much hope to continue with working on in the future. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kiri. And for everybody listening, do use the Q&A if you've got questions or comments. We'll try and pick some of them up at the end. Now over to Rachel Gardner, who, of course, you will know is the archival lead on the Miscellaneous Reports project. Rachel.
Thanks, Felix. So hi everyone. So I'm Rachel, and for the last 2.5 years, I've been cataloguing the Miscellaneous Reports Collection. And the purpose of that has been to make this really complex collection more open and more accessible. And cataloguing and indexing aren't the most glamorous always of topics, but they are a really vital part of making collections more accessible. So now it will be possible for users to actually see what's in the collection and follow new paths of research. And also by indexing plants, products, subjects, people, it will mean that people can travel across the collection in new ways that were probably impossible before, and make connections across the huge geographic span of the collection. As Johanna said in the panel session yesterday, and Kiri referred to just now, we are working within organisation and cataloguing systems that were designed for a very different kind of user, very often a particular kind of 19th century user. And a question is how we can, or if we can, work within those systems to give the kind of access we'd like to today. So yeah, as Kiri has spoken about, navigating the colonial nature of this collection has been really challenging part of this project, and it was just amazing to hear the really rich session that's before this one, where we heard from the speakers knowledge and perspectives on tackling these issues. In my very limited experience, it just seems to be a real ongoing process, and it really needs a kind of sense of both people and organizations being reflective, self-critical and self-reflective, and as Miranda mentioned in the panel yesterday, acknowledging that there are more than one ways of doing things and to be open to those changes. And in this way, indexing subjects, people, plants, places, as I mentioned, it helps to liberate information in the collection and allow new ways into accessing it, but it is also a confining structure that needs to be re-examined as to what they allow to be recorded and what they miss. During the cataloguing, I've tried to navigate this path in small ways, really, whether that's through signposting indigenous plant names, as Kiri mentioned, and bringing out hidden information that's been unprivileged in the arrangement of the volumes over 100 years ago. And sometimes that's been as simple as, for those that caught my talk on the Tuesday, the Nigerian gardeners T.B. Dowdoo and Ferdinand Lee. It's just simple as kind of naming them in the catalogue record when they weren't named before. They were kind of labelled under the term training young gardeners. So just trying to bring their stories out and make that accessible. And also working to kind of obviously contextualise the collection and kind of thinking about these issues when we think about outreach. But what's been really difficult is coming up against a kind of level of cataloguing, level of detail that's been possible in the catalogue. And is it, how, and that's a real question that I've been thinking about, is obviously there's a whole range of different actions that can be done to decolonise an archive, but some of those are small and things that you can just kind of get on and do, but other things are bigger and maybe more radical. But I do think that is just like quite another kind of unglamorous point to make, in that project funding, which is brilliant, and many archives rely on this to be able to make these collections available, but you have a time limit and you have a level of detail that's possible in that time, and it's kind of working, that's been frustrating really. I feel like it's been an absolutely incredible experience working with this collection, but I found myself walking a really frustrating tightrope between wanting to go down every rabbit hole and research every hint of a hidden story or narrative that's not been openly there in the collection, and then the need to actually finish the catalogue and to allow others, people around the world, to start doing this work too and start making these connections. And as we've seen, it can't just be one person with one perspective, it needs to be open to many perspectives and many different lenses, and well, including kind of more history, of course, but activism and other creative projects. In the panel yesterday, Miranda described her curatorial practice as enhancing the database, making more connections, reuniting untold narratives, adding more context, uncovering untold, partially hidden or absent stories. And I really hope that from what we've seen over the last few days, that a global research community can build on this catalogue, and we can enhance it going forward with different partnerships and collaboration with different perspectives. And it's just been the most fantastic experience to hear from the different speakers, the amazing speakers and panelists over the last few days, and have the questions and engagement from the audience. And it's like the dream of anybody working with a collection to see this happen and see more people engaging with it. And over the last few days, we've had people join us from over 50 countries, which is just, it's a beginning. I think we can go much further than that, but it's just more than we ever dreamed would be possible. And when we were first thinking, how do we kind of create an event, it would probably have been at Kew last year before the pandemic, and meant that we needed to change our plans. I'm really worried I'm running over time. Do I need to stop? I guess I'll just kind of wrap up by just again repeating that I just really hope that the engagement and the excitement and energy of the last few days can help us kind of go forward into doing more with this collection, and looking at not only how it's catalogued, but how we can build on that going forward. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And in this world of screens, I can confirm this is not just the dream. Thank you so much. We're going to hear something about research now from Caroline Cornish, who's an honorary research associate at Kew and a museum historian and working on plant humanities. Caroline.
Thanks, Felix, and hi everyone. Yeah, I'm a historical geographer at Royal Holloway, but I'm also an honorary research associate at Kew, and I've been conducting research on or with the collections at Kew for over 15 years now. For me, the issue in this conference has been, how do we go forward in terms of the sorts of histories we want to write, we want to encourage others to write, and maybe we even want to commission using the Kew collections. And two themes in particular have emerged for me over the last 3 days. Firstly, what's come through loud and clear is that we need polyvocal representations of the history of Kew and Empire. History is written from a broad range of perspectives and concerning the histories of a broad range of people, the colonised as well as the colonisers, women, LGBTQ histories, to name but a few. We need more than just the history of Kew equaling the history of its directors. Those stories are important, but we need to enhance them with other narratives, as Miranda did so eloquently put it yesterday. And that brings me to my second point, and this is recalling the words of Rowan Deb Roy yesterday. We need histories of Kew that pay more attention to the role of labour. We typically look at specimens, at artefacts, at the mobilities of plant commodities, the products we make from them, and of course the wealth accruing from that. But we also need to heed those whose labour created that wealth, colonised peoples, indentured labourers, and subaltern actors. And we need to tell their stories too. That's all from me.
Oh, thank you very much, Caroline. That was very succinct, thank you. Mark Nesbitt is research lead in economic botany, and he's going to say something about research in the collections as well. Mark.
Thank you very much, Felix. So I'm curator of the Economic Botany Collection, and as I'll talk about in a moment, also work with many colleagues at Kew on developing our humanities research programme. And it's been 3 days of really rich and thought-provoking, even provocative talks, and it's really hard to reduce down, and some elements that really resonated have already been picked up by the other speakers. So I wanted really to return to 2 points, and both of these are, if you like, rather strategic. They're thinking a little bit ahead to what Kew should be doing, because our COVID recreation in 2020 and much of this year does seem to have been on generating new strategies for Kew. And one is the starting point is this fantastic letter from Richard Drayton to Kew's librarian and archivist, Sylvia Fitzgerald. They wrote in 1990, and I hope, Kerry, we're going to ask Richard for a copy of that for the archives. And one quote from it: "Kew is therefore in many ways not only the trustee of its own past and of the memory of botany, but of the modern experience of much of the world." And that's a statement that really brings responsibilities, around access, for example. And I think Richard referred to sort of lack of state support for big digitization projects in the UK compared to other countries. But I do think research has could have a really important role to play here. And if you think about the Mobile Museum project with Felix and Caroline, through support from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, we're able to get all of the registers for the Museum of Economic Botany online on the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So I think it makes our little museum one of the very few to actually put its online, original registers online. And that, of course, has been an absolute lifesaver in the last year or so for people using the collection. And right now we're working with Historic Royal Palaces and National Archives and Kew Archives. They're thinking about ways of getting the plants in and out registers online for a similar research-driven route. And I think, sort of take-home message is we need to consider our specimen collections, archives and libraries as one unit when we're thinking about access and digitization. And we need to be thinking quite long term. We need to be asking ourselves as an organization, because none of these collections can go online instantly, where do we want to be in around about 10 years' time with access and availability for these. And then secondly, echoing Caroline's point about polyvocal responses to the archive. And it's clear, as Vanita said, that in order to get the most out of these quite complex archives, you need close reading, you need different forms of knowledge, both technical experience, perhaps as a historian might bring, and lived experience to do this. And how, as holders of archives, how can we facilitate that? And I think here there's a really essential role for humanities as a discipline, sitting within the scientific institution of Kew. I hope that you've gathered from the conference, we moved far away from what Richard Drayton described at the start. The researchers are coming in and being given the files. We see our role much more as enablers, not controllers, but enablers. Whether the 5 collaborative PhDs in progress at the moment, 2 more on the way this autumn, through collaborative research projects, as in this conference, as a forum for debate. At the moment, that Humanities Initiative is quite informal. It's driven by myself, by Library Art and Archives, by Felix, by Caroline, and it's maybe time to formalize that in the form of a center or institute for humanities of the kind that you find in Berlin or New York or Dumbarton Oaks. And just thinking of an example of that interdisciplinary approach embedded within Kew, A really good example is the current project in Richard Spruce's Amazon collections in the mid-19th century. And that's a multiple collection, archive, herbarium, economic botany. It involves ethnobotanists at Kew, in Rio de Janeiro, in Sao Paulo, Luciana Martins, art historian at Birkbeck, and many indigenous colleagues at the Federation of Indigenous Indians of the Rio Negro. And actually, as I speak, Luciana is hosting a Teams meeting via this miracle of satellite technology of a number of villages in the Amazon, working out exactly how this kind of collaboration can be equitable, and language, which has come up a lot in these conversations. There is a really major element of that, negotiating English, which is Bruce's main language, my main language, Portuguese, Tucano, Banawa, and other regional languages. And it's a project that really directly connects historical archives to a region in which issues of human well-being and biodiversity conservation, the two central elements of Kew's mission, are really crucial today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And finally, we have Mark's colleague, Sonia Danda, there you are, who works in conservation policy at Kew. Sonia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felix, and to the conference organisers for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I'm Sonia Danda, and I work as a science policy advisor at Kew, and I'm part of the team which coordinates Kew's response to the global environmental conventions that frame our scientific research and collections. As we've been hearing from this conference, one of the aspects covered in the miscellaneous reports is an insight into Kew's collection histories, revealing stories of our collections acquisition and the correspondence at the time. And echoing much of what Rachel and Kiri were saying about Johanna's comments on how the collections were ordered and classified during the 19th century, and how we can frame our collections and widen access, to the 21st century, and making sure that it's in a format accessible to all. But it's important also to note that the discussions we've been having around the miscellaneous reports around access and connecting collections, cataloguing, that these apply widely to all collections. For example, other collections at Kew include the herbarium, fungarium, DNA, the seed bank, and of course the economic botany collections. And our modern day practice at Kew in terms of collections acquisition are underpinned by the United Nations Global Framework, known as the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the key elements to this framework are to ensure the conservation and the sustainable use of biological diversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. Now, this aspect of access and benefit sharing is at the core of our practice of research and our data and collections. I think this conference has been a great example of acknowledging and recognizing Kew's colonial history and the discussions on how we re-examine our current practices and to ensure inclusion, ethics, and equity in our work. At Kew, we're taking a holistic approach to this and reviewing how we can facilitate access to our collections and working towards digitization, although we know this is only the first step, as we have to ensure appropriate knowledge management, for example, being mindful of offensive wording on label data, the language that the material is accessible in, and advocating for open access where possible. And echoing Caroline and Mark's comments on diversifying voices and revealing and restoring stories, Kew is the partnership-based organization, and co-production of knowledge and stories is at the heart of our discussions going forward. And really echoing what everyone has been saying at this conference is that in finding these solutions, it cannot be done in isolation. And I feel this conference has highlighted the importance of working together, long-term collaborations, exchanging knowledge and best practice. That's all from me, thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sonia. And I think everybody can hear outside how this is a conversation going on within Kew, as well as Arike started off saying at the beginning with organizations and groups outside Kew. Very fascinating context there, Sonia, in terms of that, the Convention on Biological Diversity and so on, which and issues around access and benefit sharing, really important context for the work of the archivists as well as the scientists at Kew. We've got a couple of questions. I'd encourage you, if anyone's got any comments or questions, we've got a few minutes. I think it's probably 15 to talk together. There are two questions that are, again, raising issues really about catalogues and access and making material available or useful to people interested in the case of miscellaneous reports. And I think this is, the questions around language and information that have come up today are really, really big ones. But there's a specific question maybe for Rachel and Kiri about when the digitized index is made available, are there plans to make resources available on guidance to users and researchers?
I don't know, I can jump in on that one. No, that's a really great question. Yeah, at the moment, so the catalogue it is partially, but will be completed at the end of the month, available online. And I think there's definitely room for improvement. I think more guides on how to approach the collection is definitely kind of part of what we need to be doing. In small ways, I've tried to do that in the kind of, I guess, more traditional archival sense of cataloguing, in the kind of collection level, giving information about how it was put together, as much information as I could about like the history of how it was organized, and for example, that the kind of geographic classifications are historic and that kind of, and where that came from, to try and help people coming to the catalogue kind of understand it in that sense. But I don't think it is enough, and I think we do need to work more on that and kind of discuss more ways of making it more accessible to more people. Thank you. I don't know if any of the fellow archivists want to jump in or not, but yeah.
Felix, I think you're muted.
I am. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, I agree with with Rachel. I mean, having the catalogue up there and all the kind of contextual information that's traditionally part of an archive catalogue will open up the collection. But I think we need to do work around showing people how to use an archive catalogue. It's not at all intuitive, I would say, which for us it is as archivists, but I think for anyone else it isn't. And I think we could certainly do some videos or guides or blogs or something around how to use it and how to find material in it, and a bit about the process of how the catalogue has been produced and put together, which I think will help researchers in using it.
Thank you. I've got a question. Caroline, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and remind people of something that Richard Drayton said on day one when asked what more was to be done beyond digitisation. And he said an archive like this needs championing, which I thought was a very nice term. And again, I think that's about taking knowledge of that archive out beyond Kew in forms of outreach, and I think that's something that we could all do collaboratively. Archives people, researchers like myself, collections managers, and almost sort of go on tour with this and just build awareness that this collection is here, it's catalogued, and the sort of uses it might be put to.
Thank you. I have a question. I mean, leading on from that, I read an article by Claudia Augustat, who's a curator in Vienna at the World Museum in Vienna, and she was asked to write a paper on decolonizing the museum, and she wrote an account of an exhibition, but she ended up with 3 issues that were really important in the end. One was the structure of catalogues, one was resources, which I think Kiri and Rachel sort of made clear about time, perhaps, and other kinds of resources. But the third one was space. The spaces in museums, in her case, or in Botanic Gardens in Kew, in your case. Are there issues here for organisations? I think we certainly heard in the Back Cultural Archives session some comment on this. What kind of adjustments, facilitations are necessary to an organisation that wants to widen access to collections? Are current arrangements around space and access to these collections physically on site, right? Or is there new thinking that should go on there? I mean, that's really an open question for all the speakers, if anyone's got any examples they want to talk about.
I'm happy to start off if that's okay with others. So Black Cultural Archives at BCA, our space is a Grade 2 listed Georgian building, which has had so many different lives, from being a home, a family home, to being a car showroom, to being a squat. So it's, you know, it's a building with its own rich history. And one of the concerns that we have about our building is whether it's a welcoming space for researchers to come in and use the collections. And one of the another concern we have about our building is the visibility of the collections and the visibility of the opportunity to do research in our collections. Having said all of that, our researcher base is predominantly people under 35 in terms of percentages, predominantly people of Black and other minority ethnicities, and actually predominantly female. Having had a reasonable number of years as an archivist, as a professional archivist at other organisations, I find the ratios at BCA really quite different to the ratios at the other institutions that I've worked at. So we must be doing something right, but I don't think that our space lends itself to inclusivity of research in actual fact. So I'm also a fully paid up and delighted member of Kew Gardens, just so you know, one of your stakeholders. And I love going to Kew Gardens. If I weren't an archivist, I wouldn't know there was an archive. And so that's that's just something that I'm sure you're completely aware of. But I did want to share the solidarity of understanding that the spaces that we use are not necessarily the physical location spaces in which we facilitate research is what I'm talking about. Those physical spaces are they're very specific, and they respond to a very specific type of research and a very specific type of researcher.
Okay, anyone else want to have a quick comment? We've got a few questions to come to now. We'll move on to the linked issue of language. Just a short one from Jackie Bowman. Could you talk more about how offensive language on labels, how is that being approached? Short question, big issue. Any sort of positive, interesting, creative responses to that issue of language on labels?
I'm not actually, I mean, Mark and Caroline, you might have more to say about this. I guess just briefly with the Miscellaneous Reports Collection, that's been something that's been on my mind. And there is kind of research ongoing in like the archive community about this, but for me, the issue it's definitely there, and in terms of the way things are phrased, but the issue is in the papers, is that level of description again. I've taken an approach at the catalogue level to kind of use I always forget the word, apostrophes. If there was anything offensive or something that we wouldn't want to be putting in the catalogue record that might cause distress. This has not really come up that much at the level that I was cataloguing. I mean, it has, and I think that's something that we need to kind of assess and keep thinking about, and especially other collections as well. It's definitely, I'm not trying to say it's not an issue, it's definitely an issue, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think we've got it right yet, but at the catalogue level, I've kind of made a comment about the terminology that's used in the collection and and what people might encounter in the catalogue as a warning. And I hope that maybe in the future kind of more kind of with more kind of features in a catalogue, we might be able to have that kind of link to every record, so it's a little bit more there for people to see. But sorry, I'll hand over to anybody else that might have more experience using that.
I mean, before you come in on that, there's a link question about a collaborative cataloguing environment, how to embed really, well, I suppose there's another question about polyvocal history, as Caroline referred to, into the cataloguing environment. Mark, I don't know if that's a question for you.
I'm happy to speak on that. I think on the offensive language question, as with a lot of these difficult questions, we should not be resolving this by ourselves. We should be working with our wider community and communities. And there are some, been emailed one or two great examples from other museums that have reached out, in their case, to local communities, but other kinds of stakeholders. But we're not in the, I would say, not in a position of deleting history. We maybe looking more towards warning systems, for example. In terms of different voices, different ways of entering catalogues, this has been I think when I put my job proposal in, that may well have been one of my ambitions stated in it a few years ago now. It's a really interesting and complex area. We are modeling that. We're doing an experiment in the Spruce project, working with a database specialist at Birkbeck, where one of our core aims of the project is how can we best not align and not integrate, but best work with Indigenous knowledge and with Western knowledge. It's very much a two-way learning process. The database is going to attempt to address that, but one of the messages we've received during the work is, of course, we know that database is not easily accessible in the Amazon, and that printed materials are the way to go. And we've actually been experimenting at the moment, about to go to press, with various printed materials in a number of languages for use in villages and in schools. So I think that was a reminder to us that although the digital world is quite a seductive world for us, sitting there at our desks or on our sofas with our laptop, actually that is in itself can also be quite an exclusive world, that the old paper technology still has its place.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that one? We have a question about issues of equating access and inclusion with decolonization. Do you see this as confusing or enlightening?
I can add a few comments here. I don't think it's contradictory. I think, what we're kind of saying here is we're not erasing history, we're enhancing history and adding in kind of excluded voices. So that's that, and Q has had such an integral part in that, in terms of it. It stemmed from the kind of time when Britain was colonized, Britain had the empire. And so it is part of our history, and I think it's more about what can we share, what has been, like, I guess also in terms of some of the other discussions we've had, like decentering whiteness and kind of sharing other stories, and that's where I think the emphasis should really be. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has something to add.
Caroline, do you want to come in on there? Kate Telcher has asked a question about rethinking history at Kew and what direction it's going in, which I think is linked to what Sonia has just said. Your microphone,
Yeah, okay, I'm just looking for the question. Okay, I know that you've been conducting research into future directions for thinking about history at Kew. Can you say anything more about plans at this time? The simple answer would be not at this time, but soon. We, as I think Mark has alluded to, and Sonia, we are doing a lot of work at Kew, examining our own practices, our own collections, our histories, amongst other things, all aspects really of our operations at Kew. To see how we can be more inclusive with our histories and with everything that we do going forward. So we're not just looking back at heritage collections, as the point which was made earlier by Melanie. A report, we are all contributing towards a report which should be out, I think I'm right in saying, Mark, the middle of this year. Perhaps Mark and Sonia might want to just comment a bit further on that. And at that point, we'll be able to give you some more details about what we're recommending.
Thanks, Caroline. It is worth saying we are working towards a report with recommendations in this area, both as Rachel referred to, things that can be implemented very quickly and easily, and things like a research agenda for history that require a little bit of thought, but we need a formal commitment to start that thought and some timelines for the outcome from that.
Well, thank you very much, dear panel, for concluding the conference, but not the discussion. That was fantastic, really interesting. I'm going to now hand over to Kiri for some final words. But before I do, I want to just pop in a little tribute to Library, Art and Archives at Kew. They've been central to this conference, but to a lot of what we've talked about. So it's great to see you centre stage, actually. So thank you very much. Over to Kiri to wrap up.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much, Felix, for that tribute. That was nice. So it has fallen to me to close this conference and thank everybody who's made it such an interesting and successful 3 days. We very much hope that everyone attending has enjoyed it as much as we have. And I very much feel this is just the start of conversations around this collection, Miscellaneous Reports, which will hopefully continue for a long, long time. I just want to reiterate that the conference has been recorded, so you can catch up with anything you might have missed or want to see again. And please do share it with colleagues, friends, students, anyone you wish. We'd also like to produce a publication from the conference, but this is still very much in the preliminary stages. Do get in touch if you have any ideas around this. Now on to a very long list of thank yous. Firstly, I must thank our keynote speakers, Professor Richard Drayton and Professor Benita Damodaran, who opened the conference on days 1 and 2 so brilliantly. I would also like to send a big thank you to all our other speakers, chairs and panelists who all did a brilliant job. I'd like to thank Arike for curating and chairing such a brilliant session today. Arike, it's been a real pleasure working with you for this conference, and we very much hope we can continue to do so in the future. I'd like to thank Fiona Ainsworth, Professor Alex Antonelli, and colleagues in LAA and Science at Kew who've enabled this conference to go ahead, and also our colleagues in digital experience and IT at Kew who've assisted with the more technical side of things. I must thank our funders, the Linnaean Society and the Bentham Moxham Trust, and also Wellcome for funding the cataloguing and conservation project, without which we wouldn't be holding this conference. I must thank all of our behind the scenes volunteers, the people who've ensured that things have run smoothly, who you probably haven't seen as attendees. In particular, a massive thank you to David Ogudwen, who's done so much in making sure Zoom and the tech is all working. And David, there's a floral thank you on the way to you shortly. I'd also like to thank Kat Harrington, Rose Taylor, Christina McCulloch and Chelsea Snell for their help behind the scenes. I must thank our conference organising committee as well, who've committed so much time and effort in making this event happen. That's Mark Nesbitt, Caroline Cornish, and in particular, Rachel Gardner. When we first applied for funding from Wellcome, we wrote that we would hold a small event at Kew to promote the collection to the research community. Partly because of the pandemic, but partly as our thinking has evolved, this has turned into the global virtual conference that you've attended, with over 1,000 international attendees and speakers, which we're absolutely delighted about. The fact this event has become so big and global and kind of encompassing in themes has really been down to Rachel, who has made this happen. She's poured so much energy, thought and time into this event. Thank you so much, Rachel, and there's a floral thank you on its way to you shortly too. Finally, thank you to all of you, our attendees, and everyone who's come along and participated in our conversations and made it such a truly kind of excellent and engaged event. Thank you so much, and please do get in touch, keep in touch with us, and let's keep these conversations going. Okay, thank you and goodbye.